Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Sarah Mancall, the Policy Director for the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, and we are hosting today's policy webinar in addition to many other NGOs that have consultative status at the United Nations. I'm going to just give a few logistical details, and then I'm going to turn it over to today's moderator. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is a little globe icon, and that is for interpretation, English, Spanish interpretation. So if you would like Spanish interpretation or Spanish to English interpretation, you can click on that icon at any point today. Also, we have a chat box, and you're welcome to include questions, comments in that chat box. And as well, we have a Q&A box, so you can direct questions specifically for the Q&A portion of the event, which will happen toward the end of the event, into that box specifically. And now I also want to add a quick note that today's session is being recorded and it will be on SPSSI's YouTube channel afterward. That's www.youtube.com/SPSSI. So anyone who can't attend today, or if you want to watch it again, feel free to check it out there. And then I'm going to turn it over to today's host, Dr. Corann Okorodudu. She is a professor emerita of psychology and Africana studies at Rowan University. She also serves as a UN NGO representative of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues at UN headquarters in New York City, and is coordinator of the SPSSI SDGs anti-racism campaign. So Corann, take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues and its partner, the American Psychological Association, as well as member state and NGO co-sponsors, it is a distinct pleasure for me to welcome all of you to this virtual side event entitled Best Data Disaggregation Practices for a Whole of Society Ecological Systems Approach to the Elimination of Systemic Racism and Progress on the Elimination on the Implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2015, the UN General Assembly launched the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals with a highly visionary introductory section promising to protect and fulfill human rights for all by ending racial, gender, and other forms of inequities and discriminations, leaving no one behind. However, the targets and global indicators developed thus far to evaluate progress on the SDGs have not reflected an equally promising focus on this highly visionary human rights commitment. In 2020, the UN NGO representatives of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues launched an anti-racism campaign at UN headquarters in New York City, asserting that the 17 Sustainable Development Goals would be attainable only to the extent that racial, ethnic, and other human rights inequities are acknowledged, meaningfully assessed with disaggregated data, and consistently addressed through comprehensive, concrete policies and programmatic actions. We are now at the halfway point of the Sustainable Development Agenda. How well have member states done with implementing the SDGs? We are finding that racial and ethnic discriminations and the use of disaggregated data have largely been neglected by member states of the UN since the start of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda in 2015. Recent evidence also shows that most of the countries of the world are far off track from making significant progress on the SDGs agenda. This lag is largely due to a number of intersecting multiple crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic, political attacks against national democratic governance, assaults against social, economic, and environmental human rights, systemic racism against African descendants, indigenous people, and other people of color, national and international armed conflicts, climate change disasters, all compounded by lack of resources for making substantial financial investment in sustainable development and the use of disaggregated data to assess the impact of these factors. As a result, a report published earlier this year by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network provides evidence suggesting that not even a single SDG is expected to be met by 2030. Therefore, as we move forward beyond this midpoint of the Sustainable Development Agenda, we call upon member states of the UN and other stakeholders to take bolder, transformative actions in order to rectify these structural deficits and achieve more concrete evidence of progress on implementation of the SDGs. Now I will switch over to beginning the panel. I will start with the first panelist, Dr. Kelley Haynes-Mendez, who is Senior Director of the Human Rights Team of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Kelley Haynes-Mendez is a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in topics related to human rights, equity, inclusion, and global education. She holds a PsyD degree from the California School of Professional Psychology. Dr. Haynes-Mendez is an APA fellow and also received a presidential citation from the Society for the Teaching of Psychology for her forward-looking and innovative work. She will give a presentation that addresses the Human Rights and Racial Equity Action Plan of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Haynes-Mendez, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I am going to pull up my slide presentation, and I hope that you all can see my notes here. So I want to say how grateful I am to the invitation and for having an opportunity to speak on this topic, both sort of personally and professionally within the American Psychological Association, and then as a psychologist working in the discipline of psychology and having some experience historically with teaching psychology to both undergraduate and graduate students around multicultural issues and global education. I am very excited that we as psychologists are having these conversations and really looking to enhance our understanding of this work, and also leveraging how psychological science can be leveraged to help eradicate all forms of discrimination, and specifically, as we're talking about today, the eradication of systemic racism. I want to begin by sharing a little bit about at APA, our population health approach. In 2022, the association released a statement on population health, which helped us to define how psychology can be leveraged toward a whole of society approach. Population health, according to the statement, focuses on improving the health equity, safety, and well-being of entire populations, including individuals within those populations. The population health approach is supported by multidisciplinary science, from psychology as well as from sociology, cultural anthropology, medicine, economics, education, and other disciplines. This approach really helps to aim and address the cultural, economic, systemic, historical, environmental, relational, and occupational contexts that influence health status and well-being, including mental health and other forms of health equity and functioning across the lifespan, with an ultimate goal to foster equitable human flourishing. The population health statement goes on to affirm that an individual's health cannot be considered in isolation from relationships, communities, and societies. This is our sort of whole of society approach. There are major influencers and social determinants of health outside the traditional healthcare system that include but are not limited to education, work and work setting, environment, legal and regulatory frameworks, income, racism and discrimination of historically marginalized groups, social connectedness and stigma. And these conditions do often exist systemically and structurally outside of individuals. So to advance population health, a biopsychosocial perspective is important across the lifespan and across the communities and settings where people live, work, learn, and play. Some of the recommendations within the population health framework include, psychologists can be essential partners in the development, promotion, and dissemination of science-based solutions to advance population health, but we cannot do it alone. Population health science and its applications continue to develop through the efforts of multiple disciplines. As such, it is important for psychologists to work collaboratively with partners across diverse systems and settings. Secondly, prevention and early intervention are crucial aspects of a population health approach. In collaboration with others, psychologists contribute to the development, dissemination, and implementation of a science-based model of prevention and early intervention, as well as validated tools to screen and monitor unmet health needs. Advancing a population approach requires investment in the education of psychologists and trainees in all settings, specialties, and communities. It is important for the psychology workforce to understand population health concepts as well as community engagement strategies. And then finally, collaboration with a broad array of national, state, and local stakeholders is crucial to effectively implement a population health approach. Those partnerships can look very different, but may include healthcare allies, such as professional healthcare associations, hospitals, and other healthcare services, indigenous and tribal healthcare authorities, and community mental health organizations. I want to move now into the sort of primary topic of today's event, which is the eradication of systemic racism. To give a little bit of background and some of the science from sociology around systemic racism. Systemic racism can be described as having inequities across racial categories, in addition to racialized outcomes. Those outcomes are inequitable outcomes based across racial dimensions. And that can be within a number of different types of entities. They can be institutions, organizations, or societies that have these sort of inequitable racialized outcomes embedded as a result of systemic racism. And so the elimination of systemic racism really requires a two-pronged approach, understanding the dynamics of racialized outcomes, and then also creating processes by which to discover and subsequently address those outcomes. So one, we need to understand that racialized outcomes by way of systemic racism exist. Number two, we need to evaluate our organizations and institutions so that we can discover what those outcomes are. And then finally, use specific strategies to address those specific racialized outcomes that we do discover. There's a prominent sociologist, Victor Ray, that talks about this quite in depth, and I wanted to read a quote from his article entitled "Why So Many Organizations Stay White." Dr. Ray states, evidence of individual discrimination is obviously important, but these bad actor or explicit views cannot account for the broad empirical patterns of organizational segregation and the deeply unequal distribution of organizational resources. It is also important to think about how the normal and legal functions of predominantly white organizations gain from and exacerbate racial inequalities. Current legal remedies for discrimination rely on the bad actor model. Employees can potentially sue for intentional discrimination, for example, if an employer uses a racial epithet. However, those legal remedies would have little to say about discretionary promotion procedures that may favor white employees or a business choosing to locate in a neighborhood that would make them inaccessible to people of color because of residential segregation. Indeed, this latter active discrimination may become moot if poor access to public transportation and long travel times weed people of color out of hiring pools. So this is an example of the different levels and types of racism, that there are examples of interpersonal racism, and then there are examples of institutional and structural racism that may not always have, we don't always have the capacity or a legal remedy for those types of systemic racial outcomes. APA also has released a resolution in 2021 entitled Harnessing Psychology to Combat Racism, which adopted a uniform definition and understanding of the various levels of racism. And I want to go through those very quickly. The different types of racism include internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. Internalized racism consists of the values and attitudes we can hold within ourselves as people of color. So this may include someone having an experience of diminished attractiveness or beauty standards based on an adoption of societal norms. Interpersonal racism is the types of racial prejudice and bias that we see in relationships and in interpersonal interactions. These may include derogatory terms and phrases and actual physical violence in some examples. Institutional racism is very much part of the description that Victor Ray describes in his work around organizations and having institutions have sort of embedded practices that have a result of racialized outcomes. And then finally, structural racism are the sort of laws, policies, practices that contribute to how systemic racism is sustained in terms of time and length, but also how it is sustained within society. So I want to talk a little bit, again, very quickly around APA's strategy for advancing racial equity in response to a recognition of these various types of racism and how systemic racism has been both embedded in an organizational, institutional level, as well as within the discipline of psychology. As we, as an association, move forward in our journey toward dismantling systemic racism and advancing racial equity within the organization, the field of psychology, and broader society, we are actively reshaping the way we work and collaborate within and beyond the discipline. The association understands that achieving and sustaining change requires a commitment to disrupting siloed ways of working. And next, I would like to walk through some of the steps the association has taken to foster meaningful, systemic, and sustainable change. The association's governing council in 2021 adopted an apology at its Council of Representatives meeting That apology acknowledged that APA failed in its role leading the discipline of psychology, was complicit in contributing to systemic inequities, and hurt many through racism, racial discrimination, and denigration of communities of color, thereby falling short on its mission to benefit society and improve lives. In constructing the apology, APA benefited greatly from a report generated by Division 45, which was called the Warriors Path Report. That particular report noted that all formal apologies with integrity should include what was done, an acknowledgement of the impact. Consistent with the Warriors Path report, the apology is seen as a first step toward reconciliation. And then finally, each apology should include which steps will be taken to ensure that the behavior does not continue. And so our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office has really taken the lead and has been the source of the brain trust around the APA's racial equity work. The 2022 Racial Equity Audit Report served as a baseline to help the association establish a path forward and evaluate the progress that would be necessary in order to demonstrate sustainable impact. The audit helped to inform a racial equity action plan, which outlined further details about the steps the association would be taking toward racial equity. Those 5 key domains emerged in the Racial Equity Action Plan. Those 5 domains are knowledge production, health and health equity, the APA workforce, and the psychological workforce, the training of psychologists, and finally, the education of psychologists. And so in generating large-scale organizational change, we took statements from the commitments from APA's apology, moved then into the racial equity audit of all programs and activities ongoing in the association that were dedicated to racial equity. The Racial Equity Action Plan was developed. And then as a result, both a Racial Equity Fund as well as a Leadership Development Institute designed to improve leadership capacity for marginalized communities and other groups were both developed as a result. The Racial Equity Fund was seeded by a $1.1 million grant that honors the commitments made in the racism apology, as well as in a trio of resolutions that focused on the eradication of racism. It will provide a sustainable and long-term strategy that is more responsive and accountable to the communities most impacted by racial injustice. At the guidance of the board of directors and also informed by member surveys, there's a recognition that we can't do all 5 of these things simultaneously, and that we would need to make priorities and prioritize, 2 of the 5 areas. And so with the racial equity think tanks and surveys and in discussions with members, the health dimension, utilizing the full breadth of the field of psychology to promote, contribute, and advance health equity in communities of color, as well as knowledge production, which integrates the use of equitable and inclusive approaches to advance racially conscious knowledge production and scholarship, were selected as the 2 priority areas. I mentioned previously that we have now, our EDI office has now hosted 2 racial equity think tanks. The second racial equity think tank was held just last month. And the sort of action plan for the racial equity think tanks is to bring together participation from psychologists as well as community members to offer insight and feedback into how the racial equity action plan is implemented across the association and also within the field of psychology. And lastly, in terms of next steps, the office will continue to engage with staff members and various stakeholders to develop strategic implementation plans that outline the organizational infrastructure and processes needed to scale existing promising strategies and to develop new ones to embed racial equity into the fabric of our association. And with that, I will conclude, and I welcome any of your questions throughout the remainder of this event or subsequent to the event. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Doctor. I really welcome this presentation on the APA action plan because it has a structure that can inform how communities and organizations can assess the various systems that are involved in their operation and to determine the degree to which inequities exist, discrimination exists, racism exists, and then to plan an approach for the eradication of these forces. So we will hope to have a little more discussion on this as we go into the discussion period. Our second panelist is Dr. Margarita Guerrero, development statistician and senior consultant on SDG gender indicators for the UN Food and Agricultural Organization. Dr. Guerrero has over 40 years of experience as an academic, official statistician, expert advisor, an innovator and leader in statistical capacity building in national and global settings, improving availability and access of disaggregated data with gender data as a focus and statistics for policy use as a lifelong passion. I remember when we first invited her to be a speaker, she expressed her passion for the work that she had been doing over the years. She led and directed statistical programs at UN SCAP at the University of the Philippines at the Philippine Statistical Office. She will now share her knowledge and experience on the topic, best data disaggregation procedures, data collection, data analysis, and the communication of disaggregated data outcomes. Dr. Guerrero, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Corann, for that warm introduction. And good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Let me share my screen. And while I do so, just let me say that even though is that fine?
Yeah.
Okay. Although we have a very I think that okay, long title. Let me just say that when we're talking about best practices, this field actually is replete with a lot of practices and recommendations currently. And while in the field of statistics, the science of data disaggregation and the tools that come with it has a long history. I think it was with first the MDGs and now the SDG indicators that have actually given a lot of push towards the question of, hey, you have these tools, how is it being used, in fact, to advance the goals and targets to inform how they can get advanced for, in this case, the SDGs. So let me just, my presentation is divided into two big parts and then a small part. The first two actually looks at disaggregation as it is used in the monitoring of progress in the SDGs. And I will start with this picture. Most of the global reports start with global figures. And so you would have, for all the SDG indicators, there's going to be report on progress at a global level. And then it comes down to disaggregation, and this is actually a level of disaggregation that allows to have the figures of the indicators by the regions in the world. And in fact, if you look at the reports, particularly of global institutions, then you would see the breakdowns according to regions. And for any such breakdowns, the objective really is to be able to compare progress, and therefore you go to this idea that targeted interventions are going to have to take that into account. The rate of progress differs across regions. So, for example, I work with the Food and Agriculture Organization, and one of the indicators that they focus on are food insecurity and severity. And in communicating the information that they have about this, this is an example of that. They talk about the world, which is here, but then they also break it down according to the huge regions, essentially. And therefore, it's so obvious the differences here. That is one of the broader uses of disaggregation at this level. To be able to do this, that's a long story. And there's another level of disaggregation whereby the regions are also disaggregated by income level. There is a technical definition of how they do this, but countries are divided into low, lower middle, upper middle, and high income. And this chart shows where the high income countries generally are and the low income countries generally are. So that also provides us granularity. But then when presenting statistics along these lines, such as this, then we are now able to compare and then ask the question, so what accounts? This income level, in fact, accounts for the differences, the disparities in the behavior of, in this particular case, prevalence of undernourishment. So it's quite obvious that we have very low numbers for low-income countries compared to your upper middle income countries. So in the end, you compare this, so what do we do about it? There's another classification that also disaggregates further. Countries are divided into developed, developing economies, and economies in transition. And when you look at global statistics, these statistics are presented as well along these disaggregations. Again, comparisons. And we also have a classification that classifies these countries as what is this thing? That classifies countries as least developed, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. So these maps show you where landlocked, small island developing states are and the least developed countries are. And if you look at the statistics, again, of global reports, then they're also broken down into these. Again, it gives then the information on what kind of programs, when we're talking about financing for development, who do we put this on? When we're talking about loans, etc., then that is part of the criteria that is being utilized. So that's a broad level of disaggregation. So next, okay. And in more recent years, actually, we now have data that classifies countries according to disaster risk. According to disaster risk, that also classifies countries according to the impacts, the negative impacts of climate change. And here again, this information, while put together at the global level, and helps us look into the issue, not just at the global level, but at the country level. So from there, we zero in to national differences. And in fact, at the HLPF right now, if we are going to listen to the VNR reports, then we would be able to compare the progress of countries, of specific countries that have volunteered to show their progress. Because in the end, when we're looking at progress in the SDGs, it's actually people that matter. It should be the people that matter. How do we translate all of this broad knowledge at this geographical and geopolitical subdivisions so that then it makes a difference with people? One other broad way of doing this is, is where when you're talking about gender statistics in particular, the chart shows that, in fact, this is also one, let's say, middle level of disaggregation. You show in this particular case, this is the statistic on the participation of women in integrated water resource management, which is much related to the way to the issue of water resources and availability. And this exhibits how our reports, not just at the regional level, can now be disaggregated into by sex or gender. So it is the people that matter. And when you look at the promise of the SDG framework for indicators, it said that these indicators of development should be actually disaggregated. If you look at it in a one dimension by sex, gender, age, disability status, ethnicity, their location, the income level, the migrant status, the race at one level. You can plug in educational level, their employment status, and so there are quite a few on this dimension how you should be providing statistics so that you're able to look at inequalities, disparities. But let me also say that this concept of their cross, this can be cross-tabulated, and the concept of intersectionality, how these various factors actually affect each other. On the matter of racism, discrimination due to that, discrimination defined along those lines, then statistically, the data that are collected that should have a bearing on this would be ethnicity, at least, and race. Right? But if you look actually at the SDG indicators, unfortunately, for which these levels of disaggregation are made available, there were none. Even though there's been a promise to have these available in at least 12 of the existing indicators. So, in fact, there's a lot of work. Therefore, that would be the broad conclusion here that needs to be done along these lines statistically, along statistical measurements. So let me point it out. But just to highlight this need to zero in on particular subgroups on people, I'm presenting here the focus areas behind agri-food systems, which is area of focus of work of the FAO. 3 focus areas: equality, non-discrimination, and equity. And without going into the definitions for this, let me just say that it is strongly recognized that there are vulnerable groups and major challenges, so that when you're looking at the issue of improving their livelihoods and well-being, you need to identify these vulnerable groups very specifically and the challenges that they face. So this study has been done in some way, and for agri-food systems, we're looking at, let's look at some of the vulnerable groups: smallholder farmers, rural women, landless farmers in rural areas, particularly women and young women and men. So farmers, rural women, landless farmers in rural areas. So it's one, these are 3 groups of 3 vulnerable groups defined, and the reasons they're vulnerable have been documented in that case. And we can even go more. You look at communities, the pastoral and semi-nomadic communities, displaced people, including refugees and migrants, people with a disability, peri-urban and urban poor, particularly women and children, and people with disability. So one, we are wanting to reach out to vulnerable groups to make sure that there's equality, to make sure that they benefit without any discrimination. Then we need to clearly define who the vulnerable groups are. Let's even go further. When you talk about farmers, which are the stakeholders for agri-food systems, then you can actually disaggregate this further from commercial estates to large commercial family members, small dependent family from etc. until you have the small subsistence-oriented family farmers. So the question, speaking from the point of view of the statistician, is if you want to be able to capture these vulnerable groups, how do you capture them? How do you first identify them through the statistical tools that are existing, and then which is the major challenge here, and then how do you get the information that would be relevant to them? So I'm here pointing the challenges of actually data disaggregation. So operationalizing the concept of leaving no one behind for the SDGs, since in fact, up to this date presents challenges. In this year's HLPF panel, we are looking at SG 6, and in fact, monitoring sustainable use of water resources. In many of the, I think there are several discussions in this side events. In fact, then the need, the gender disparities, the kind of agri-systems that are existing, all of these have disparities across the different groups, and they need to be well studied and more studied. Let me zero in on a particular indicator. As Dr. Corann has said, gender statistics is one of my passions, and currently is one of the areas that we've been closely looking at. The indicator on the percentage of people with ownership or secure rights over agricultural land, indicator 5A1. And in order to improve the information on this, which are not provided in your standard statistical tools at the moment, like surveys or even censuses, then we have been looking at the application of models to small area estimates. Before I go to just briefly describing what one study that we've done there, let me just say that for this particular indicator, we already know that we need to look at the values at the subnational level, depending on the country. That can be a province, a district, a municipality. We need to compare urban, rural locations. We need to look at the type of documents that women and men hold in terms of ownership of agricultural land. And then we need to look at disaggregation by income level and age class of individuals. But if you look at the currently available data on this particular indicator, none of these are available for many. For one, this indicator is available only for like 43 countries right now, out of the 100 plus. And for those countries, I can remember a handful that are able to give you urban, rural, for instance, location of the household, but not the other types of disaggregation. So we applied, if you're a technical person here, we applied the area level model for small area estimation tools using what they call the pay period model. But anyway, the reason we use these models is because the data that is commonly available, like from surveys, whether they be agricultural household surveys, will not allow you to give information at a small area, the district level, for instance, let alone to get you to calculate this kind of indicator for the women and men living within those small areas. So that is the reason behind why we looked into modeling. And we used not an agricultural data survey, but the demographic and health survey for this. So we need to be innovative as well as to what the data source is, using as much information that you can get in order to come out with the estimates, the small area. And based on the models that were utilized, it ended up that if you compute the upper side shows you, the upper graphs here show you how what you would get if you compute it from the survey itself, the survey data itself, and you'll find out the gray areas, for example, you cannot estimate anything. But if you use the model, then you increase the number of estimates that you have. That's what is shown in the lower chart. Okay. And it's true for all the indicators under indicator 5.8.1. Okay. You get more estimates at smaller areas. And so based on the study, which is quite encouraging, we have a tool that allows us to get more information about this indicator, and the technique itself can then be looked at in terms of applying it not just to geographical areas, but possibly if you have survey data on, let's say, ethnicity or race, then you might be able to apply the same techniques. I will not go into more details about the technical aspects, but Dr. Corann has actually said that the reason that I caught their attention to be part of this was because of this practical guidebook on data disaggregation for Sustainable Development Goals, which we put together with a team for the Asian Development Bank, the INEGI SDGs group, and many other countries who had actually allowed us to use the practices, the experiences that they've had on trying to use data disaggregation techniques, the various tools, so that for some of the indicators, they're able to give estimates. And this is available online. I don't want to go into it, but indeed, it does go into topics, including some examples on how data disaggregation can be done in existing data, and as well as how you communicate this, how you analyze it, how you communicate, how to use it for policy interventions, and how you communicate, which is actually what we are interested in here. And just to summarize, I copied this chart from Statistics Canada. I think we have a Canadian colleague who will be speaking to us, but I like this because it reminds us that all of these different aspects of an individual actually intersect with each other. And when we start talking about discrimination, we're talking about racism, then these are not one-dimensional phenomena because there are intersections among the interplay among these various individual characteristics come into form. So it's a reminder for us and the challenges that we have really when we are to use data disaggregation. So we've come into this session to ask, why does disaggregation matter? I think I have tried to answer that partly. We're going to hear more in the next two talks. If disaggregation is so important, why isn't it more common? And yeah, why is it not? Perhaps, in fact, I will pose more questions. And what can be done to make disaggregated data more widely used or produced? I have hopefully given some answers to that, but we have to push, I think, and answer some additional questions. In fact, there have been quite a few studies that tell us that have looked at the issue, that have told us how important it is. This publication, it's highlighted on the left, talks about the 2030 agenda demands for data. It emphasizes that data disaggregation is needed. It emphasizes that you need to work in strengthening the national statistical systems and that you need more financing for this. But there are many recommendations, and I'd like to zero in on two such things. I gave you an example of how modeling works. Okay. But, you know, many times when estimates are given out based on models, there are always questions. Are this accurate enough? You're making a lot of guesses here. Are they good enough in order to be used for actual policy formulation and the designing of interventions? Well, if you remember the diagram of how you zero in on the most vulnerable of vulnerable farmers, then you'd say, well, if you want information, this is not the time where you demand perfect information, I think. Don't you think so? Some information based on, as far as we know, scientific standards is better than no information at all. But it is an issue, the questioning of model-based estimates. The other question I'd like to pose and not provide an answer, but just food for thought, is data sources. Most of the data that are being encouraged to be utilized, even for the production of SDG indicators, are those coming from official statisticians, from official statistics. But as you've seen in the illustrations I've shown, many of you need to get closer and closer to the people whose status you would like to be able to measure. And when you look at the standard statistical tools that we currently have, that's only up to some level that they're able to do that. But you have a lot of groups, civil society organizations, who are actually closer to the subpopulations, the subgroups that we want to be able to measure progress, look at their status, see how they can actually benefit from all the development planning that's going ahead. So the question, actually, this is being explored currently in the community of the data community, but again, the challenge. We now have new actors in the data production side and the data producer side, which are not part of official statisticians. So how open are we, honestly, in saying, yes, we should consider this data and the statistics that they provide as part of the information that are useful for policymaking. So that's where I end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guerrero. I think you have given us various ways of conceptualizing what we mean by disaggregation. That there are different levels of disaggregation. But one of the things that really stuck out for me was your idea that we need to get closer to people in doing disaggregation. We need to get closer to people because people count, and we need data that will enable us to assess where these various potentially vulnerable groups are, and as a means of developing policy with regard to creating better livelihoods for them. So hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that in the question and answer period. We now move to our third panelist, Mr. Adrian Franco Barrios. He is the Vice President of the Governing Board of the National Institute for Statistics and Geography in Mexico. He holds a master's degree on public policy and management from the University of Manchester in England, a master's degree in public administration from the Center for Economic Research and Teaching in Mexico, and the bachelor's degree of political science and public administration from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. From 1997 to 2009, he held several positions in the Mexican federal public administration related to public policies against corruption and improving and evaluating governmental performance. Since 2009, he has been responsible for governance, crime, and justice statistics in the National Institute for Statistics and Geography. Mr. Franco Barrios will present on the results of the 2022 National Survey on Discrimination in Mexico. Mr. Franco, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Corann Okorodudu. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see the presentation very well. Thank you very much for the invitation to the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues and the people inside this society. I am very pleased to be here in this very important and interesting side event with also my colleagues of the panel, very interesting presentations. I would like to share with you a very brief presentation of the results, the methodology and the results of our very recent survey, the National Survey on Discrimination, which was released very few weeks ago, 5 weeks ago in Mexico. And it is the second, is our second wave of this National Survey on Discrimination. First of all, let me tell you that in order to study this kind of topics in the National Institute for Statistics and Geography of Mexico, INEGI for short, we also consult a lot of experts and several organizations related to human rights, the National Human Rights Institute, and also local human rights, and of course, the National Organization for Preventing Discrimination, and also the local ones, and also a lot of academicians and experts in order to integrate the conceptual framework for the survey. So this is a very weight exercise in which, of course, our general objective is to recognize the magnitude of discrimination in these various expressions in everyday life. In particular, my colleagues, in previous presentation, they show us several issues related to how to explore discrimination and how to disaggregate data. And for us in this National Survey on Discrimination, it is very important to know who discriminates, the areas of life in which this phenomenon occurs, the sociocultural factors, and of course, understanding the perception of discrimination in general population and specific population groups. We have in this survey 10 groups of interest, very important for us related to discrimination phenomena. People, indigenous people, migrant people, children, domestic workers, Afro-descendant people, religious diversity people, adolescents and youth, disability people, elderly, and women. And of course, you can see there the total estimates of population of each of these groups of interest into the total population of Mexico, and of course, the characteristics of the people who we go with into the survey. Of course, we can give results in the survey for each of these group of interest, which is very important in order to know or to accomplish the general objective of the survey. A very quick, our sample size of this survey is more than 42,000 households in all the country, across the country. We use a face-to-face method in order to approach to the respondents of the survey. With an electronic questionnaire, we use tablets or small tablets in order to collect the data. And the response rate for us, it was 84% of the total of the survey. We collect the data from July to September last year. And of course, we can give data at national and state level and for each group of interest. I will not go too in deep in the definitions, because this is very extensive, very extensive conceptual framework for this. But we use as a basic definition of discrimination as a social rejection based on the stereotypes, prejudice, stigmas, and cultural values on what a society or social group considers to be acceptable characteristics. Of course, we consider discrimination, and of course, it includes racism and other specific expressions as a structural phenomena. And structural because it is extensive in the population, and of course, in a long periods of the appearance of this phenomena in our population. Just to tell you, because one very important focus on this panel, in this side event, is the data disaggregation. We can disaggregate data by groups of interest, by these 10 groups of interest. As we already said, geographically, it means national data. By state, we have 32 states in Mexico. So for each state, and of course, for the population of 18 years and older, and the domain of the household in rural or urban areas. And because of the demographic of the household, of course, by sex, by age, by birthplace, and the place of residence in 2017, in order to know if they move, because remember that this is the second wave of the survey, and the first one was in 2017. So 5 years ago, we would like to know if they move from in the household or inside the territory or outside. And specifically for people of 6 years and older, in order to know the data for children, we have the segregation of a level of the education, health service affiliation, if they speak an indigenous language, about the religion and literacy for these people, and for the people of 12 and older, in order to explore adolescents and young people, marital status and activity status. The results, we structure the results of the survey in this way. First, by social perception of discrimination, perception of respect to the rights of group. The rights is very important in order to approach to the discrimination, the recognition of rights of the people, and the acceptance of actions for equality. Prejudice, social stigmas, and stereotypes. Permissiveness of discrimination, it means that if the people allows to be discriminated or not, and openness to diversity in different areas of the general population. Of course, discriminatory practices and experience for all the 10 groups of people, and other groups, for example, skin tone, and other groups like sexual or gender diversity also are included in the results related to discriminatory practices. The main results for each category, and very important at the end, is to look at structural effects on discrimination, and we explore effects on education, labor markets, and of course health, and of course a lot of data. We use, just to say, we use several questionnaires. We don't use a general questionnaire because we have different populations as focus at the groups of interest, and also because we have to go. It depends on the sampling on different regions of the country. So we have a general questionnaire and modules. The modules are related to the specific populations, and a general population opinion and experience questionnaire. So I would like to show you some of the very few results of this survey. Imagine that the executive summary of this survey is about 250 pages. So it's a very long survey results report. So I would just give you a very few data of this. The central data for the survey is exactly the same data, for example, for the SDG indicator 16.B.1, the proportion of population reporting having personally felt discriminated against or harassed in the previous 12 months based on a ground of discrimination prohibited under international human rights law. And the data for this indicator in Mexico is 23.7. It means the total prevalence of discrimination in Mexico. As you can see from 2017 to 2022, we have an increase of the total prevalence of discrimination in Mexico, not just in general, but also if we split the data into women and men, if we disaggregate the data, we can see also the increase of discrimination in both women and men as a general number. Well, for the same number, for the same indicator and the same total prevalence, we can disaggregate the data for each state. For us, it's very important at INEGI, at the National Statistical Office, it's very important to have data at least for each state in order to contribute to public policies. In this case, public policies related to prevention and tackling discrimination, because we give the data to each government in these 32 states, so we can see and compare the total prevalence of discrimination across the different states. And this how this 23.7 at national level, we can see the extremes of, for example, some states like in the south, Yucatan, or in the center, in the middle of the country, Puebla, Mexico City, or Querétaro. There's this other state in the center. They are above the national average. And of course, we have in this in green color and other states in which the level or the prevalence of discrimination for all the population is less than the average, is under the average, but also is not very satisfying, because the less is 13.8 and the maximum is 32.1. So we have an issue or a red light related to discrimination. Of course, we can disaggregate the data by reasons for discrimination between women and men. For example, related to political opinions, who are discriminated by political opinions, by sex, by age, by their religious beliefs, social class, place where she or he lives, the marital or familiar status, the skin tone of the people, if they have any disability, are they discriminated, or being an indigenous or Afro-descendant person, or by sexual orientation. And we can compare this data between the two waves of the survey in 2017 and 2022. Of course, by each group of interest, we split the data by age and by sex and other characteristics, as we already said. For example, if you see, we have a very unfortunately increase of discrimination across the different groups. For example, indigenous people, Afro-descendant people, disability people, migrants. In migrants and Afro-descendant, and also in sexual and gender diversity, this is a new categories in 2022. We didn't have the data in 2017. In 17, religious diversity is the only one who the characteristics of people who have a reduction in the discrimination, but also adolescents, women also increase the discrimination against them, and population of 18 and older as a general population. You can see the increasing of discrimination practices against them in the last 12 months. But the most important here is, again, to insist on the relevance of disaggregating this data. And we can see also as just by sex related to all kind of discriminations, for example, all the types of discrimination for the people. And we can see here just men and women and the reasons by which they are discriminated in general. And of course, we can see, as we said, the data by each group, and the disaggregated the data for women and men. You can see that, unfortunately, as is in other kind of data and other kind of statistics, women usually are more discriminated than men in each of these groups. And this is a very, very important in order also to complement the public policies related to increase or the gender public policies, or improving the life of women, also public policies. But you can see the difference between women and men and in the different groups. Also by age, we put the data by different groups of ages. For example, from 18 to 29, from 30 to 59, and also 60 years and old and older. And you can see how the different reasons for being discriminated can concentrate or not in different ages, and also in groups, in order to make a cross-variable or intersectional analysis is very important for us. You can see, for example, in Afro-descendant people who is in the very, very productive stage or of the life, from 18 to 29 is a very concentrated and very common to be discriminated. This is the people who are in very, very productive, also in 30 to 20 to 59. And you can see the difference in the extremes or in the other ages. Also, we explore the perception of the respect for the rights. It means that people, according to different groups, they feel or they have experienced some respect or not respect for their rights, and as an approach in order to know the discrimination. And we can do as a frequency, if they feel that it's very frequently or much, sometimes low frequency or nothing discriminated because of the rights. And you can see the groups, the children, women, adolescents, domestic workers, migrants and refugees, homeless people, homeless person, indigenous, farm or agriculture, gay or lesbians, and trans persons, transgender persons with a religion other than Catholic, and so on, in order also to know if they feel or have experienced respect or no respect for their rights. Another way to approach of discrimination is to look at the problems that different groups of interest are facing. For example, in the case of Afro-descendant population, they are discriminated. Their main problem expressed by this population is to be discriminated based on their appearance, or population with disabilities, for example, where there is no facilities to walk in the streets or to go by the streets or in the public transportation, or inadequate for the conditions, which is a way to itself to be discriminated. Or religious diversity population, for example, where they feel or they have experienced lack of respect for their habits and tradition. And we can see every major problem faced by this specific population as an approach to explore discrimination. And finally, of course, we explore the structural effects of discrimination in all the groups, and the groups you can see here on this slide, the percentage of population unable to read and write by group of interest. And well, the data is not here, but of course, in these groups, in all these groups, this capacity of to read and write is less than the general population. And you can see here, for example, indigenous people in general terms is 13% of the population, but it increased in women. Again, women are concentrated in the more affected part of the proportion of this group. Disability also 15%, or elderly people 12%. But you can see again, women are more affected by discrimination related to structural effects. Another exploration of structural effects are, for example, the population according to the condition of employment benefits when they are employed by some enterprises, government, or any other organization. if they have a written contract or if they have all the access to public health services. And let me tell you that again, these groups are less entitled to access to public health services. So, for example, in the case of indigenous, it's just 18% who the people who can access to public services or who has a written contract. For example, Afro-descendant is almost the less than the half of the population, or migrants, again, women and sexual and gender diversity population. So this is just an examples, a few quick examples of the data, and of course the data of this survey is very, very extensive, and I invite you to consult the data in the web page of the National Statistical Office in Mexico, INEGI. Thank you very much, Dr. Graham, and all the people there. I am very attentive to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your very extensive presentation on discrimination in Mexico and the categories that are affected more or less by discriminations of different types. We would be interested in having the identification of your website so that we can look at the data more closely. Our last panelist is Ms. Ima Okonny, Chief Data Officer of Employment and Social Development in Canada. She has over 21 years of experience in the field of data. She has extensive experience with building evidence through the development of analytical databases and tools, implementing departmental data reporting and release strategies, data management, data privacy protocols, and with forward-looking policy development and research. Ms. Okonny has an educational background in mathematics, computer programming, public management, and during her tenure with the Government of Canada, she has received several nominations and awards for her leadership and significant results. I ask Ms. Okonny to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Okorodudu. I'm assuming you can see my screen and hear me clearly. Perfect. Thank you. I'm joining you today from Ottawa, Canada, which is really on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation and the just getting all of us together to have this very important conversation. I was really impressed by the introduction, that was said by Dr. Guerrero. Also, your introduction, Dr. Haynes-Mendez, in terms of the context you provided us on the systemic issues, and also Mr. Franco, on just how you showed us you use disaggregated data to identify some of these systemic issues in society. My presentation will come from a slightly different perspective because I don't sit in the National Statistical Office. Canada. And I will show you some of the considerations that we've taken in terms of not just reporting on some of the challenges we've seen in terms of disaggregated data and the populations we serve and deliver services to, but some of the work we're trying to do to uncover some of what Dr. Haynes-Mendez spoke about in terms of the systemic issues and some of the challenges in terms of making sure that we're doing this right in a way that meets some of the parameters of both the law, the ethical considerations, and making sure that we're not perpetuating some of the systemic issues that were discussed in the earlier presentations. So I will dive into this by first of all telling you that I'm coming from Employment and Social Development Canada, which is basically a department within the government of Canada that has its mandate to primarily build a stronger and more inclusive Canada, and to make Canadians just help them live more productive and rewarding lives, and really looking at improving the quality of life of everybody across this country, regardless of if we're talking of people in urban areas, rural areas, people in more remote communities, regardless of what community we need to serve, and just making sure that it's in line with some of those SDG goals and some of the values of what we're trying to promote in terms of equity and just fostering respect for a lot of the international standards that we have put into place as a society. So to set the context of where I'm going to go with my presentation, in order to really deliver services and improve some of the quality of life of people across the country, we really need to look at disaggregated data. And Dr. Okorodudu, Dr. Guerrero, and everybody who has spoken has basically really reflected on this, the need for disaggregated data to understand the populations, to be client-centric in our approach, to make sure that we're including all the communities that we should be serving, and also making sure that we have this client-centric insight in terms of what we do. The balance of this, though, is that we need to make sure that, as we're leveraging disaggregated data, as we're collecting this data, as we're designing policy around this data, we're really making sure that we're keeping the risks in mind in terms of some of those security, legal, ethical, and privacy protocols, because we want to make sure that we're not perpetuating some of those issues that have already been discussed, which I won't go into. So we want to make sure that we're doing this in a way that preserves trust, so that we can continue to do some of this important work in terms of identifying some of the challenges, while at the same time being transparent, of some of the work we're doing in terms of it making a difference to the lives of people. So we don't want to just collect data for collecting data's sake and reporting back. We want to be able to take this data, take these results, and then incorporate it in how we look at policy, how we shift policy design, and how we deliver services, and how we help people achieve full potential. So in terms of how we look at granular data and disaggregated data, like I said previously, we really want to make sure that we're using it to understand, some of the gaps, some of the underserved, some of the challenges and the people that are most at risk across the society. We want to make sure that it's being used for interventions, short-term, medium-term, long-term interventions. We want to make sure that as we look at this data and leverage data, we're looking at things in a way that's responsible and basically stands the test of accountability in terms of what we're doing. We want to be able to report, like I said, on what we're doing, and also monitor the impact. So if we're reporting and we're using our reports and data to shift outcomes, is it really working? Do we need to change what we're doing? And do we need to intervene in terms of how we're designing our programs? So for example, we're looking at things like how we reach everyone and eliminate some of those systemic issues that are leading to people being underserved or being in certain situations across the country. So I'll start with a standard discussion about some of the work that came out of our last census. So if you go on our website, Statistics Canada's website, you will find a whole plethora of data. You will find disaggregated data on the composition of our population, geographic breakdowns. You will find gender breakdowns, gender analysis. It's very comprehensive. We have a very strong statistical institute. And I put this high level here just to give people a sense of Canada and the composition. We're a very diverse country. We're made up of both a Francophone, Anglophone population. We have a growing number of immigrant population. We have an indigenous population that's also diverse. And in the latest figures from the official census numbers, we saw that 16% of the total population were between 0 to 14. Our working age population is getting older, so the disaggregation helps us see what that composition is in terms of the working population. And 19% of our population was aged 65 and over. And what that means is when you start looking at disaggregation in terms of looking at the gender differences, looking at the differences in the different populations and communities, you will start identifying some of the at-risk communities and the issues we need to really focus on in terms of how we deliver services and how we tweak our programs and policy to meet those who are most at need. I also put a level of basically data here in terms of the indigenous populations in Canada that make up 5% of our population. And you can see the breakdown, and I also included a link to our live population clock. Our population just hit 40 million quite recently. And you can click on that link and go on that website, and you will see a breakdown by geographic region. You'll be able to read some of the publications from StatScan. So again, very extensive and thorough disaggregation is available to the public, and by a click of a button, you'll be able to see the different components of our population. I put this chart here just to give an idea of some of the shifts in the demographics in Canada. So we have a growing distribution of immigrant population. There's a level of disaggregation here, but you can actually go on the website and look at this composition by age also, and look at some of the countries of origins of some of the more recent immigrants that are coming into the country. So this shift in population requires us to really keep abreast of some of the data in order to understand, some of the policy intervention, the program interventions, and better ways for us to analyze, some of the shifting dynamics in terms of really making sure that we continue to grow a very strong Canada and maintain some of those core values that you saw at the beginning of the slide in terms of the mandate of my organization. And I spoke lightly of trust, and in terms of us collecting all this data and all these people, I think we'll be amiss if we don't take a pause here and speak of the trust element, because Dr. Haynes-Mendez, you spoke very eloquently of some of the systemic issues and those contexts around the population. And I think it is extremely important for us to also consider, as we're collecting all this data, the trust issue in terms of transparency. And I think you flagged the significance of working within communities and making sure that some of that context comes into how we're collecting data, some of the methods of how we're collecting it, the interpretation of that data, and making sure that we're doing this in a way that's reliable and safe and doesn't lead to some harmful impacts of some of the communities that we're collecting this data and reporting this data on. So one of the things we actively do is work very closely with our statistical agency in terms of making sure that we're keeping abreast of some of the shifting technologies around how to preserve some of those privacy considerations, while at the same time reflecting what you said, Dr. Franco, Mr. Franco, about how you're looking at that data and how you're aggregating that data and reporting back on that data. So we work very closely in terms of really looking at things like privacy assessments, making sure that the legal considerations are incorporated into everything we do, things like encryption, making sure that we're anonymizing that data. And I think Dr. Guerrero spoke about modeling, using techniques like modeling, sensitivity analysis, and also making sure that the data has a degree of quality in it, so that we're not reporting things that are not consistent or not consistent with the context of the different communities we need to report on. The other factor, and I think Dr. Okorodudu, you hinted to this at some point when you talked about the importance of kind of expanding how we look at data collection to some of the community organizations that are also collecting data and working with different communities. We're doing that actively in terms of looking at co-creation with stakeholders, co-collection, leveraging expertise across the different institutions, like looking at even the academic communities, looking at nonprofit sector to see how we can work together to make sure that as we collect disaggregated data, it is sound, it is consistent, and that it's also representative of the communities that we serve. The other factor is we're very big on the transparency aspect, where you will see a lot of data is published openly. Like I hinted to the link on Statistics Canada's website, where you'll see a lot of disaggregated data. And we have a Government of Canada open data portal where you will see data that's publicly available under an open license. And you can actually go there and extract and do analysis and read reports on some of the issues of the day. So I included this slide just to give people a sense when we talk about some of the practices in terms of how we collect this data and how we think of it and how we ensure the transparency in terms of what we do. We have actually shaped a framework in terms of how we not only collect this data, but manage this data, report on this data, and leverage this data in terms of how we use it to shape policy, analysis, outcomes reporting, and the feedback loop in terms of how we shift some of the work we do. So we have basically designed a data strategy that includes 4 core components in terms of how we think through practicing data collection, data analysis, reporting back, and really using those results in terms of how we look at some of the outcomes that we want to get to. So we have a foundational data infrastructure that integrates this data and keeps it in a very secure location. We have a whole model around governance and trust in terms of how we steward this data to make sure that we have the right policies and standards around how we manage the data. And then we have a piece of data culture and literacy, where we want to make sure that people understand the ethical implications of gathering this data and the need to make sure that we are constantly co-creating with communities. We're sharing this data in a way that meets the test of legal and privacy considerations. And we're also upskilling and building capacity in terms of how people use this data to shape some of the work we need to get done. The other piece around this is data innovation, which is really looking at this data and seeing how we can really push some of the improvement and reaching everyone in a way that is more efficient and really meets the expectations of Canadians, and also in terms of how we're looking at things like visualizations. I saw a lot of visualizations in the previous presentations. So you'll see that we're pushing the envelope on that, looking for ways to tell the story in a way that's easier to digest, and also provisioning this data in different ways, including ways like the web channels you've seen, using easy videos to be able to tell the story of the data. The other piece that I wanted to emphasize on is also the need for us to consider using some of the ongoing shifts that are happening in terms of the Privacy Act, the legal considerations, some of the regulations around what we do. Many of us know that there's a lot of talk about some of the changes that are happening in terms of how artificial intelligence is leveraging data. So we're keeping abreast of some of those changes in a way that makes us consider that some of the data that people collect can be used for other purposes. which might not always be safe for the communities that we're speaking of today. So a lot of what we've done is really wrapped around the Act, the Privacy Act. We keep abreast of the shifting technologies, and we want to make sure that as we collect this data, we disaggregate this data, we keep the control. So some of the recommendations that really came out of the work we've done, in terms of data disaggregation to feed policy shift, is to make sure that whatever you're doing with data, you're regularly consulting with your legal department, security aspect and privacy aspect. Make sure that you keep co-creating, co-developing with stakeholders on a continuous basis, masking personal identifiers, de-identifying data, leveraging anonymization methods, ensuring that your retention and disposition protocols are followed, ensuring transparent documentation, being able to trace back, and also include clauses as you share this data in terms of the limitation of the data, the caveats behind this data, and some of the challenges that you came across as you try to collect this data. We found that sometimes publications don't always contextualize how this information was collected, and this can lead to further systemic issues. So being transparent around some of the data limitations, the gaps in terms of how you collected this data is extremely important as we look at collecting more and more disaggregated data. In terms of a practical example of what we've done in terms of really pushing the envelope on data disaggregation, at the height of the pandemic, what we found was some sectors of the economy were more deeply impacted in terms of job losses, and because of basically the closures that happened during the pandemic. So we took an active project with our statistical agency and actually looked at things like linking data, with the labor force survey, the Canadian income survey, and the survey on disability, and also the census of population. And this work really enabled us to have a fuller insight into some of the demographic characteristics of those who were really impacted, by the pandemic. And we were able to really look at some immediate interventions, which you can publicly see on StatsCan's website. So from that work, what we were able to see was that there were considerable number of workers in the accommodation and food service sector who were significantly impacted by the pandemic. And we were able to quantify this and disaggregate this even further. And if you go on the website, you will find it. We were able to disaggregate this data and look at the gender differences, the age differences. We were also able to link this data to what communities people were from, what geographical areas. And by doing this, we had a better idea of what policy interventions were needed. So the argument about disaggregated data and needing more disaggregated data for insight was made by some of this work we had done. In terms of data sharing, like I said, we really believe in the transparency and the accountability. So the data is available on our open data portal. I put a link in the slides for people to go and take a look. We also have arrangements with academics where they can actually go and look at some of this data and look at research through our research data centers across the country. So people in different provinces can go and access this data, look at how basically different things have shaped the different provinces and the different regions across Canada. We also have a piece of proactive disclosure where we proactively publish some of the reports and some of the analysis we've done. And again, it's all available on our website. So as I come towards the end of this presentation, the one thing I would like to leave for consideration is, as we push for more disaggregated data and we work on publishing more disaggregated data, we shouldn't forget, the need to maintain, and really develop growing trust among the people we're collecting this data on. It is extremely important that we move beyond just the data and just the technology and take really proactive steps in terms of really making sure that the data we're collecting fits the purpose we're collecting this data for and the intended use of the data, and making sure that we're using this data to actively shape some of the improvements that we need to see in society. The other thing I will leave also is the need for the ongoing assessment in terms of what we're doing, the risk mitigation strategies, our data collection, is it having positive impact or are they harmful impact in terms of what we're doing? It's important to consider things like the data literacy aspect. So as we collect this data and interpret this data, is it true to the context that it was collected in? And does it really fit the message we're sending out and publishing in terms of some of the societal implications of what we're doing? It is important also to leverage the expertise, from cross-industry, private sector, community groups, academia, government, non-for-profit, continuously work on opportunities to, collaborate, peer review process, and make sure that we're building trust and expanding in terms of the positive impacts of this work. The ongoing transparency, I cannot overemphasize that. Because we need to consider things like indigenous data sovereignty. People we're collecting this data on, we need to be able to make sure that we've done our due diligence in terms of communicating, making sure people understand the why behind the collection and the use of the data in terms of shaping positive impacts for the people we collect this data on. Explainability is a very significant factor in terms of explaining how we're collecting it, what we do with the data, how we handle it, how we manage it, and the ongoing engagement, engaging with people, the diversity and inclusion, making sure that we're involving different people across society in terms of thinking about how we do data, how we collect data, how we use data, and how we really work on shaping policy programs. And as a whole, just improving the lives of the people that are represented in all this nice data and basically the nice charts and publications that we're all working on.
Okay.
So I will stop here and pass it back.
We are well past our time, but I wanted you to get to this point. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now that we are far from our the time constraint, maybe we should take some time to get a final conclusion or a final one takeaway that each of you would like to leave with the rest of us. One takeaway for, by each of the panelists. So who would like to start?
I mean, I can start since I was already speaking before. I would say the key thing is we're collecting all this data. We have a lot of expertise looking at this data. It would be very important for us to use this data for good and communicate back in terms of the changes this data makes to the lives of people. So we should never forget that this is about people and it's about improving the lives of people. So that should be at the center of everything we do. And I'll pause there.
Thank you. Thank you for that. One takeaway.
Definitely strengthen partnerships, more partnerships. I'm glad to hear that actually across all of our distinguished speakers here. And there are tools, they're challenging, but they can be actually utilized.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Franco, you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Corann. No, just to emphasize the relevance of having disaggregated data, it's so very important, not just to report any indicator, but also to be sure that when authorities and institutions make public policies are very precise on the results in specifically in this case of discrimination, to share data and the methodology with international community, national community, with authorities. It is all very important to be very precise in the effects and the results of public policies. So thank you very much for the invitation here to share this data. Thank you.
I'm sorry I don't have the time. We don't have the time, but I was going to ask you what some of the policy implications from the work that from the survey that about discrimination in Mexico, but time constraints are on us. Okay. Is Dr. Kelley?
Dr. Haynes-Mendez had to leave for another meeting, but she said she is happy to answer any questions by email, and I'm going to drop her email into the chat for everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm sorry that we went over the time, but our panelists had very valuable information to share with us, and so I thank each of them for making the time to be with us today and to share their results with us. If you haven't done so already, please share a copy of your PowerPoint with us. And also, I hope that document has the link to your website so that we can check in, as you have welcomed us to do. We can look at various kinds of results you have that we might be interested in following up. Thank you very much. We appreciate your role and we appreciate your time. Thank you, Sarah, for
Thank you. And as always, this will be up on SPSSI's YouTube channel. We have all of our UN events there, and we have a number of events specifically on this topic of data disaggregation to combat racial injustice. So if you're interested in this topic, there are a number of great events that we've recorded on this specific topic. So check it out. I'll have this event up by close of business Monday. So you can direct your colleagues there if they missed this event live.
okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
It's a lot.